James Sullivan came back to himself the way a diver surfaces after too long underwater, slowly, reluctantly, each sense returning like bubbles breaking the surface one by one. First there was warmth, not the sterile chill of a med bay coolant blanket, but something softer, almost organic, like lying in sunlight on soft moss. Then sound filtered in. Distant water trickling over stone, a low melodic hum that might have been wind through leaves or machinery so advanced it mimicked nature. Pain arrived last, dull and widespread, a reminder that his body had not yet forgiven him for what he'd done on Viridian 7. His ribs ached with every shallow breath. His left shoulder throbbed where it had been wrenched from its socket, and the burns along his arms and back pulled tight beneath whatever healing gel or bandages covered them. Yet none of it felt urgent. For the first time in what felt like years, the universe wasn't screaming at him to move, to decide, to save someone else before the next collapse. He opened his eyes. The ceiling above was not metal or composite. It was carved stone, pale gold veined with darker amber, rising in graceful arches that caught the light pouring through tall, narrow windows. The room smelled of something floral and mineral at once, jasmine mixed with warm sandstone after rain. He lay on a wide bed draped in fabrics that shifted color subtly as he watched, from deep indigo to soft twilight blue. No monitors beeped. No tubes snaked across his skin. Just quiet, and the knowledge that he was not alone. Two figures sat beside the bed on low stone benches carved to resemble curling vines. One was tall, regal, her skin the color of burnished copper under moonlight, etched with faint bioluminescent patterns that pulsed gently like distant stars. Her hair long, thick, woven with threads of gold cascaded over shoulders clad in a robe of midnight silk. Her eyes, large and golden, held an ancient weight. Beside her, much smaller, sat a child of perhaps 12 standard years, her features a softer echo of the elders, the same copper skin, the same luminous markings, though hers flickered more erratically, betraying youth and uncertainty. The child's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles pale with tension. Neither spoke. They simply watched him, silent sentinels who had clearly been there for some time. James blinked, trying to reconcile the impossible. Queen Lyra of the Nethan sovereignty. Princess Myra, here, beside him. The last time he'd seen the child, she'd been screaming, separated from her escort in the collapsing transit hub as the star's instability tore the planet apart faster than anyone had predicted. Her 6 royal guards had bolted for the last shuttle when the ceiling began to give way. James hadn't thought. He'd simply scooped her up, thrown his body over hers, and run for the secondary evac tunnel while debris rained down. He remembered the heat of plasma venting nearby, the crack of ribs against falling girders, the child's small hands clutching his uniform as if he were the only solid thing left in the universe. Then darkness. Now they were here, in what had to be the Nethan palace on their homeworld of Ethera. How long had he been out? How had he gotten here? He tried to sit up. Pain lanced through his side like a hot wire. A small sound escaped him, more surprise than complaint, and instantly the Queen leaned forward. "Be still, James Sullivan," she said. Her voice was low, resonant, carrying the cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without raising her volume. "Your body is still knitting itself back together. The healers have done remarkable work, but even Nethan medicine requires time." He froze, more from the use of his full name than the command. No one called him James Sullivan except in official reports. To most he was just Sully, or Lieutenant, or lately the idiot who stayed behind. "Your Majesty," he managed, throat dry. He inclined his head as best he could without aggravating his shoulder. "Princess, I didn't expect to wake up here." The Queen's lips curved in what might have been the faintest of smiles. Few humans have ever seen the inside of these chambers. Fewer still have earned the right to wake in them. Myra shifted, her large eyes fixed on him. She didn't speak, but her markings flared briefly, a soft violet pulse that James interpreted as hope, or perhaps relief. He cleared his throat. The evacuation. How many made it out? 3,217. Queen Lyra answered without hesitation. 73% of the colony population. The rest, the star gave us hours instead of days. No one could have done more. James closed his eyes for a moment, tallying the faces he couldn't save. The old man who'd refused to leave his garden. The mother with 3 children who'd insisted on waiting for her husband. The numbers were better than he'd feared in his last conscious moments, but they still carried weight. And the child? He asked quietly. The one I carried. Myra's markings brightened. She glanced at her mother, who nodded once. The child is safe, Queen Lyra said. She sits before you now. James looked at the girl again, really looked. The same delicate features, the same wide golden eyes that had stared up at him from beneath his arm as the world fell apart. Recognition hit like a second wave of pain. You're her, he whispered. Myra nodded, small and solemn. Then, in a voice barely above a breath, she spoke for the first time. You told me stories. About oceans, snow, stars that don't burn worlds. James remembered fragments, whispering nonsense to keep her calm while they crawled through smoke-filled tunnels. Earth trivia. Silly things. Anything to drown out the roar of collapse. I promised I'd tell you more when we were safe, he said. You kept your promise, she replied. We're safe. Queen Lyra rose smoothly, her robe whispering against the stone floor. What you did not know, Lieutenant Sullivan, was who she was. My daughter's escort abandoned her when the station buckled. 6 trained warriors chose their own survival over hers. You did not. You had no obligation, no knowledge of her rank, yet you shielded her with your body and carried her to the last functioning evac shuttle. For that act, Nathan Custom demands recognition. She paused, letting the words settle. We have kept the Keeper's vigil at your bedside for 2 full cycles. By our law, this vigil binds you to us. You are no longer merely a rescuer. You are family adjacent, protected, honored, and owed. James stared at her, mind struggling to process. I didn't do it for... I know, she interrupted gently. That is why it matters. You acted without expectation. The bond is irrevocable, but it is not a chain. It is a promise of mutual aid. Should you ever call, the Nethan sovereignty will answer. And should we call, we trust you will hear. Myra leaned forward slightly. Does it hurt very much? James managed a weak smile. Less than it did. More than I'd like, but I'll live. Good, the Queen said. Because we are not yet finished with you. She gestured, and the room's lighting brightened subtly, revealing more details. Shelves of crystalline data stones, a small fountain carved into the wall, flowering vines that seemed to breathe in rhythm with the occupants. It was beautiful, alien, and utterly unlike any recovery room James had ever known. I should contact my command, he said. They'll think I'm already done, Queen Lyra replied. Your second-in-command, Reeves, has been informed. He called you magnificently stupid and demanded daily updates. Your team is intact. The evacuation is hailed as a triumph across human worlds. And here, you rest. Myra reached out hesitantly, then placed her small hand over his. Her skin was warm, slightly textured like fine sand under silk. Thank you, she whispered. For not leaving me. James swallowed hard. Couldn't leave a kid behind. Not ever. The Queen watched them both, her expression unreadable but not unkind. Rest now. The vigil ends at sunrise, but the bond does not. When you wake again, we will speak of what comes next. She turned toward the arched doorway, Myra rising to follow. At the threshold, the princess paused and looked back. Will you tell me more stories? She asked. James nodded, throat too tight for words at first. Then, as many as you want. They left quietly, the door sliding shut without sound. Alone again, James stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of something far heavier than cracked ribs settle over him. Not duty, not obligation. Connection. For the first time since he'd signed up for rescue operations, he didn't feel like he was waking up alone. The second sunrise James witnessed on Ethera was gentler than any dawn he had known on Earth or its colonies. Light poured through the tall windows in thin golden ribbons that danced across the stone floor like liquid silk. The room had warmed during the night, not from artificial heaters, but from the palace itself, as though the very walls breathed in time with its inhabitants. He had slept deeply, dreamlessly, for the first time in months. No klaxons. No emergency pings. No half-remembered screams echoing in the corridors of memory. When he woke, the pain in his ribs had dulled to a distant ache, and the burns on his arms felt more like tight new skin than open wounds. Whatever the Nethan healers had done, it was working faster than human medicine ever could. He pushed himself up slowly this time, testing limits. The bed adjusted beneath him without command, firming in the places his body needed support. A small silver tray waited on the low table beside him, a crystal pitcher of clear water that shimmered faintly, a bowl of pale violet fruit cut into perfect wedges, and a single steaming cup that smelled of cinnamon and something floral he couldn't name. No note, no attendant. Just quiet courtesy, as though the palace understood he needed space before conversation. He drank the water first. It tasted clean in a way that made him realize how long it had been since anything had tasted truly clean. Then he tried the fruit. Sweet, but not cloying, more like honeyed pear with a faint citrus bite. He ate slowly, letting the flavors ground him. Outside the windows, Ethera unfolded in soft layers, gardens of glowing orchids that opened and closed with the rhythm of distant tides. Spires of living crystal that caught the light and refracted it into rainbows across the courtyard below. And far in the distance, the violet curve of the planet's twin moons still visible against the brightening sky. Footsteps soft, deliberate approached from the corridor. Queen Lyra entered alone this time. She wore no crown, only a simple circlet of woven star silver that rested lightly on her brow. Her robe was the color of twilight sea, shifting subtly as she moved. She paused at the foot of the bed, regarding him with those ancient golden eyes. "You rise earlier than the healers predicted," she said. "That is either a sign of remarkable resilience or remarkable stubbornness." "Probably both," James replied. His voice sounded stronger than yesterday. He set the empty cup aside. "Thank you for the breakfast, and for everything." She inclined her head slightly. "Gratitude is unnecessary between those who share a bond, but it is appreciated." She crossed to the window and looked out for a long moment before speaking again. "My daughter has not left the antechamber since the vigil ended. She wishes to speak with you, but she fears she will impose." James felt something tighten in his chest, not pain, but the opposite. A loosening. She won't be imposing. "I promised her stories." Lyra turned back to him. "Then I will bring her. But first, there are matters we must discuss. Matters of protocol and of consequence." She gestured, and a section of the wall shimmered, becoming transparent like glass. Beyond it lay a smaller chamber lined with crystalline shelves. On the central pedestal rested his rescue harness, scorched, dented, one strap melted nearly through. Beside it sat the small data slate he'd carried on Viridian 7. Its screen cracked but still faintly glowing with the last recorded vitals of the colonists he'd pulled from the collapse. "Your equipment has been recovered and repaired where possible," the Queen said. "The slate contains logs of every life you accounted for during the final hours. 3,217 names, each marked as evacuated or otherwise. You logged them even as the structure failed around you." James stared at the slate. He remembered fragments of that frantic recording, whispering call signs into the mic while shielding Myra with his body, counting heads in the smoke-choked tunnel, marking names when hope ran out. He hadn't realized the device had kept running after he lost consciousness. "I didn't want anyone left unaccounted for," he said quietly. "Even if it was just a record." Lyra's markings pulsed once, softly violet. "That record has already reached the Colonial Oversight Council. Your name is now attached to the largest single rescue operation in the past century. There are calls for decorations, medals, A statue on New Geneva, if the artists can capture your face from security footage. James gave a short, humorless laugh. I'd rather they didn't. Statues don't help the families who lost people. True, she agreed, but recognition has other uses. Your government has requested your immediate return for debriefing. They wish to present you as a hero of the United Terran Coalition. Your team has already been decorated in absentia. Lieutenant Commander Reeves sent a message saying, and I quote, "If they try to pin a star on your chest before you've even healed, I'll personally shoot the tailor." Despite himself, James smiled. That sounds like Reeves. The request is formal, Lyra continued. But it is not an order, not yet. Under the terms of the Nethan-Terran Accord, you are currently under our medical protection. You cannot be compelled to leave until the healers declare you fit. And I have instructed them to take their time. James looked at her sharply. You're delaying my return? I am giving you choice, she corrected. The bond we share is not one-sided. You saved my daughter when no one else would. In return, I offer you sanctuary until you decide what kind of life you wish to lead next. Hero, soldier, civilian, guest, the title is yours to choose. He leaned back against the pillows, considering. The idea of going back, of standing on a stage while politicians pinned ribbons on his chest, of answering endless questions about split-second decisions, felt suddenly exhausting. He had spent 12 years running toward collapsing buildings, failing reactors, dying ships. He was tired. Not broken, but tired in a way metals couldn't fix. And if I stay? He asked. Then you stay as kin, Lyra said simply. Not servant, not prisoner, not curiosity, kin. You would have quarters here in the palace, access to our archives, our gardens, our people. My daughter would have a teacher of human stories. And I would have someone who has seen the worst of galactic indifference and still chose compassion. James exhaled slowly. That's a generous offer. It is earned, she replied. But it is not without cost. Staying would mean stepping away from your command. Your government would view it as defection, even if temporary. There would be pressure, questions, perhaps even attempts at retrieval. I can handle pressure, he said. I've handled worse. She studied him for a long moment, then considerate. There is no hurry. Before he could answer, a small shadow appeared in the doorway. Mira stood there, barefoot, wearing a simple tunic of pale green that made her copper skin glow like sunset on water. Her markings were subdued, almost shy. She clutched a small woven basket in both hands. Mother said you were awake, she said softly. James smiled, the expression feeling more natural than it had in weeks. I am. Come in, kid. Myra glanced at her mother for permission. Lyra nodded once, then stepped aside. The princess crossed the room with careful steps, as though afraid to disturb the air itself. She stopped beside the bed and held out the basket. I brought you something, she said. The healers said humans like sweet things when they're healing. James accepted the basket. Inside lay a cluster of tiny star-shaped berries, each one glowing faintly blue at the center. They smelled like summer rain and vanilla. Moonberries, Mira explained. They grow only on the night side of the third moon. They help with pain. Remembering good things, he picked one up, rolling it between his fingers. Thank you. That's very thoughtful. She shifted her weight, suddenly shy again. You promised stories, about Earth, about snow, and oceans that don't boil. James glanced at Lyra, who had moved to stand near the window, giving them space without leaving entirely. I did, he said. And I keep my promises. Myra climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed, small enough that she barely disturbed the covers, and settled with her legs crossed. Tell me about snow first. Is it really cold enough to hold in your hands? He chuckled softly. Colder than you'd think, but soft, too. Like holding frozen feathers. She listened, wide-eyed, as he began. He spoke of blizzards in the Canadian Rockies, of snowball fights with his cousins when he was her age, of the silence that falls over a city after the first heavy snowfall. He described the way streetlights turn orange halos in the flakes, the crunch under boots, the way breath clouds in the air like little personal nebulae. Mira asked questions, careful, precise ones, about sleds, about frost patterns on windows, about whether snow ever tasted clean. He answered everything, painting pictures with words he hadn't used in years. Somewhere in the middle of describing hot chocolate with marshmallows, he realized Lyra had moved closer, listening as intently as her daughter. The Queen's face remained composed, but her markings had softened to a steady, warm amber glow. When he paused to take a breath, Mira reached out and touched his hand again lightly, almost tentatively. "You didn't leave me," she whispered. Even when it was loud and dark and everything was breaking, James covered her small hand with his own. Lyra spoke from the window. He felt something settle inside him then. Not a decision, not yet, but the beginning of one. The universe had spent years throwing him into fires. For once, it had thrown him somewhere quiet. Somewhere safe. Somewhere that asked nothing except that he stay long enough to heal. And maybe, just maybe, long enough to tell a few more stories. The palace gardens of Ethera unfolded like a living poem. James walked slowly between towering arches of translucent crystal that refracted sunlight into soft prisms across moss-covered paths. Each step felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. His body still carried the memory of trauma, even if the worst of the pain had receded under Nethan care. The air smelled of warm stone, night-blooming jasmine that had somehow carried over from the previous evening, and something sharper ozone after lightning, though no storm had passed. Overhead, vines, heavy with star-shaped blossoms, drifted lazily in a breeze that seemed to rise from the ground itself rather than fall from the sky. Mira walked beside him, matching his pace without comment. She no longer clutched her hands in front of her like a child afraid of being scolded. Instead, she moved with quiet confidence, occasionally brushing fingertips against a low-hanging leaf to make it glow brighter for a moment before letting it fade back to its natural silver green. She wore a simple tunic today, the same pale green as yesterday, but cinched at the waist with a narrow belt of woven star-silver thread. No guards followed them. No attendants hovered. For the first time since waking in this place, James felt the absence of surveillance as something deliberate rather than accidental. "They bloom at solar apex," Myra said, pointing toward a thick curtain of vines that draped from one crystal arch to the next. "When the primary sun is directly overhead, the petals open all at once. It looks like the whole garden catches fire, but softly. Mother says it's one of the few things in the palace that still surprises her after so many cycles." James glanced upward. The sun brighter and slightly bluer than Sol was climbing toward zenith. "How long until apex?" "Soon," she answered. "Maybe 20 minutes by your standard." "Time feels different here. Slower." He nodded. He had noticed that too. Minutes stretched without the constant pressure of a mission clock ticking down. Hours passed in conversation instead of crisis. It was unnerving at first, like walking on gravity that was just a fraction too light, but now it felt almost necessary. Like lungs remembering how to breathe deeply again. They followed a curving path that led past a series of shallow pools. Tiny luminous fish darted beneath the surface, their scales shifting color in perfect synchrony whenever someone approached. Mira paused at one pool and knelt, trailing her fingers through the water. The fish gathered instantly, forming a living spiral around her hand. "They remember faces," she explained. "Not just shapes, actual emotional resonance. If you're calm, they circle slowly. If you're afraid, they dart away. If you're happy." She smiled, and the spiral tightened, brightened, became a living halo of shifting blue and violet. "They dance." James crouched beside her, wincing only slightly as his ribs protested. He extended his own hand. The fish hesitated, then drifted closer, wary at first, then curious. A few brushed against his fingertips like silk. No sudden spiral, but a gentle orbiting pattern that felt almost polite. "They like you," Mira said. Or they're just being diplomatic, he replied with a half-smile. She laughed a small, clear sound that startled a nearby cluster of blossoms into premature glowing. Diplomacy is for adults. Fish are honest. They continued walking. The path narrowed, became a tunnel of vines that arched overhead until it felt like walking through the inside of a living cathedral. Light filtered through in thin golden shafts. Somewhere distant, water sang against stone. "Tell me about your home," Myra said after a stretch of comfortable silence. "Not Earth, the place you grew up. The one that made you stay behind on Viridian 7. James considered the question. Most people asked about the rescue itself, the explosions, the collapsing girders, the math of who could be saved and who couldn't. No one had asked about the why behind the reflex. "Small town," he began, "northern Canada. Snow 6 months of the year, black flies the other 6. My dad was a forest ranger. Mom taught 3rd grade. We lived at the edge of a lake that froze solid enough to drive trucks across in winter. I spent most of my childhood outside skiing, ice fishing, building forts out of snow that lasted until April." Mira tilted her head. "Did you ever feel trapped by the cold, by the quiet?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But mostly it felt safe, predictable. You knew exactly when the first melt would come, when the ice would crack, when the bears would wake up hungry. There was order. Even the disasters had patterns." She was quiet for several steps. "Ethera has no seasons like that. The suns keep the same rhythm. The vines bloom on schedule. Nothing surprises us except when something breaks the pattern like Viridian 7. Or you." He glanced at her. "Me?" "You stayed," she said simply. "Everyone else ran. Even the guards who were supposed to protect me. You didn't know who I was. You could have left me in that corridor and made it to the shuttle with seconds to spare, but you stayed. That broke the pattern. That surprised me." James looked away, toward the vines. "I didn't think about it that way. There was a kid screaming. I reacted. That's all. That's everything," Myra corrected softly. "Most people calculate, Nethans especially. We weigh probabilities, outcomes, legacy. You didn't. You just acted." They emerged from the vine tunnel into an open circular clearing. At its center stood a single massive tree trunk smooth as marble, bark the color of moonlit snow, branches spreading in perfect symmetry. Thousands of tiny star vines clung to it like living jewelry. As they approached, the blossoms began to stir, sensing the nearing apex. "This is the heart tree," Myra said. "It's older than the palace. Older than most of our written history. Every Nephin queen since the first has come here to ask one question. Only one." James raised an eyebrow. "What question?" "What must I give to keep what matters?" She looked up at the branches. "The answer is never the same twice. But it's always hard." He studied the tree. No obvious markings. Just quiet ancient presence. "What did your mother ask?" he said. Mira hesitated. "She asked after Viridian 7. After the evacuation reports came in and we knew you were still missing. She came here alone at dawn and asked, 'What must I give to repay the human who saved my daughter when no one else would?'" James felt his throat tighten. "And the answer?" "She won't tell me," Myra said. "But she came back changed. Calmer, more certain. She gave the order to bring you here instead of letting your people retrieve you immediately. She extended the vigil. She told the healers to take as long as necessary. I think the tree told her to give you time. Real time, not just medical time. Time to choose." James exhaled slowly. "And what do you think I should choose?" Myra looked at him directly, golden eyes steady, no trace of childhood uncertainty. "I think you should choose whatever lets you keep being the person who stayed." Before he could respond, the sun reached exact apex. The star vines ignited. Not with flame, nothing so crude. Thousands upon thousands of blossoms opened simultaneously, each releasing a pulse of soft golden white light that rippled outward like water disturbed by a dropped stone. The light met light, overlapped, built into waves that rolled across the clearing and up the heart tree's trunk. For a moment, the entire space became liquid radiance. James felt warmth on his skin, not heat, but something deeper, like sunlight remembered by the body. Myra's markings flared in perfect synchrony with the vines, turning her into a living echo of the garden itself. He stared, speechless. When the peak passed and the glow began to fade into steady luminescence, Myra turned to him. "That's what we mean by beauty," she said quietly. "Not something you own, something you witness. Something that reminds you the universe is still capable of gentleness." James swallowed. "I've never seen anything like it. You'll see it again," she promised. "Every day at Apex. If you stay." They stood in silence as the light slowly dimmed back to normal. Around them, small glowing motes drifted down like slow-motion snow remnants of the bloom that would settle on the moss and feed the next cycle. Myra reached out and caught one in her palm. It pulsed once, softly, then faded. "Mother will want to speak with you again soon," she said. "She's meeting with the Council of Tides this afternoon. They're discussing the future of the Accord, whether to deepen ties with Terra or pull back after Viridian. She wants your perspective, not as a soldier. As someone who saw what happened when help came too late." James nodded. "I'll talk to her." Myra smiled, small, hopeful. "Good." They turned back toward the palace. The path seemed shorter now, or perhaps he simply walked with less hesitation. His ribs barely ached. The burns felt like faint memories rather than current injuries. Halfway back, Myra slipped her hand into his. Small, warm, trusting. He didn't pull away. When they reached the garden entrance, Queen Lyra waited beneath the main arch. She wore the midnight robe again, but her expression was softer than before, almost unguarded. "You saw the bloom," she said. "We did," James answered. Lyra looked at her daughter, then back at him. "The council convenes in 2 hours. I would value your voice in the chamber." He met her gaze. "I'll be there." She inclined her head, a gesture that somehow conveyed more gratitude than any spoken word could have. Myra squeezed his hand once before letting go and running lightly toward her mother. Lyra rested a palm on her daughter's head, then looked at James again. "Take the time you need," she said. "The garden will wait." As they disappeared into the shadowed corridor, James lingered beneath the arch. Above him, the last motes of starvine light drifted down, catching in his hair, settling on his shoulders like quiet promises. He lifted his face to the sky. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to run toward the next emergency. He felt only the need to stay. The council chamber of tides was not a room of pomp or intimidation. It was open to the sky on 3 sides, framed by slender crystal columns that caught the late afternoon light and scattered it across a circular floor of polished obsidian. Water moved constantly beneath the transparent surface, slow, deliberate currents that carried flecks of bioluminescent plankton in lazy spirals. The chamber breathed with the planet. When the council spoke, the water answered in soft ripples. When they were silent, it stilled into mirror perfection. James stood near the edge of the circle, not at its center. He wore a simple tunic of deep charcoal, provided by the palace tailors, cut in human style, but woven from the same midnight silk as Queen Lyra's robes. It felt lighter than any uniform he had ever worn, and strangely right. Around the obsidian disk sat 12 Nethan elders, their markings dimmed to formal silver gray, their postures composed but not rigid. Queen Lyra occupied the northern position, elevated slightly on a low dais of living stone. Myra sat to her right on a smaller seat, legs crossed, hands folded in her lap. She looked older than her years in this setting, poised, attentive, the future already visible in the set of her shoulders. The discussion had been underway for nearly an hour when Lyra turned to James. "Lieutenant Sullivan," she said, voice carrying without effort across the open space, "you have heard the arguments." The hardline voices urged caution. Viridian 7 exposed a fragility of joint operations. Human evacuation protocols clashed with ours. Lives were lost in the gap between doctrines. Some here believe we should reduce cooperation, limit shared colonies. Withdraw our observers from Terran command structures. A murmur rippled through the water below. Others, she continued, argue the opposite. That the disaster proved interdependence. That without unified command in the final hours, far fewer would have survived. They point to your actions as evidence that trust across species is not only possible, but necessary. James felt every gaze settle on him. Not hostile, not reverent, simply expectant. He stepped forward one pace. The water beneath his feet responded, sending gentle concentric rings outward. I'm not a diplomat, he began. I'm a rescue specialist. My job was to get people out alive. I did that to the best of my ability, but I didn't do it alone. Your engineers kept the secondary tunnels stable long enough for us to reach them. Your med teams stabilized critical cases on the shuttles. Your pilots flew through plasma storms no human vessel would have attempted. The 73% who made it weren't saved by humans. They were saved by cooperation that held when everything else failed. He paused, letting the words settle. The failure wasn't in working together. It was in not trusting each other enough, soon enough. The Royal Escort abandoned their charge because protocol ranked survival above everything. My team stayed because protocol ranked lives above protocol. That difference cost lives before it saved them. If we're going to keep doing this, joint colonies, shared borders, mutual defense, then we need one rule above all others. No one gets left behind. Not because they're royalty, not because they're human, because they're breathing. The water stilled completely. A silver-haired elder near the eastern pillar spoke next. And how do you propose we enforce such a rule when species have different instincts, different values? You don't enforce it, James said. You live it. You train for it. You drill it until it becomes reflex. You make sure every soldier, every pilot, every medic knows that when the star goes unstable or the hull breaches, the first question isn't, who is this person? But can I get them out? Everything else, rank, species, politics, comes after. Myra's markings flared briefly, warm amber against the silver of the elders. Queen Lyra leaned forward slightly. And if your government refuses such integration? If they insist on separate chains of command? Then you'll lose more than trust, James answered. You'll lose lives. And eventually, you'll lose worlds. Because the galaxy doesn't care about borders when a star decides to die. Silence followed long, considering. The water began to move again, slow spirals that matched the rhythm of breathing around the circle. The silver-haired elder spoke once more. You speak as though you have already chosen to remain among us. James looked at Myra. She met his gaze steadily. I have, he said. A soft sound moved through the chamber, not quite a gasp, more an exhalation of understanding. Lyra's markings brightened to steady gold. Then hear this, she said, rising. By the authority of the Nephan sovereignty and the bond established through the Keeper's Vigil, James Sullivan is hereby granted full citizenship, effective immediately. He shall hold the title of Warden of the Outer Veil Guardian of those caught between worlds. He will advise this council on matters of cross-species rescue and cooperation. He will train our forces alongside his own. And he will retain the right to return to Terra at any time of his choosing, without prejudice. She stepped down from the dais and crossed the obsidian to stand before him. Do you accept this bond, not as obligation, but as choice? James looked past her to Myra. The girl's eyes were bright, hopeful, unafraid. I do. Lyra placed her right hand over his heart. Her palm was warm, steady. Beneath it, he felt the faint pulse of her markings sync briefly with his heartbeat. Then it is done. The water beneath them flared into brilliant violet light once, twice, then settled back to calm spirals. The elders rose as one and bowed not deeply, but with genuine respect. Myra slipped from her seat and ran to James. She wrapped both arms around his waist and pressed her face against his side. You stayed, she whispered. He rested a hand on her head. I told you I keep my promises. The council dispersed slowly. Elders paused to offer quiet words of welcome. Some touched forearms in the Nathan gesture of kinship. Others simply inclined their heads and left. Soon only the three of them remained, James, Myra, and Queen Lyra, standing in the center of the chamber as the sky darkened into twilight. Lyra looked out across the gardens. "The star vines will bloom again at dawn. Will you watch with us?" "I'd like that," James said. They walked back through the palace corridors in companionable silence. Myra held his hand. Lyra walked on his other side, her presence calm, certain. When they reached the balcony overlooking the heart tree, the first stars were appearing above the horizon. Myra leaned against the railing. "Will you tell me one more story tonight, about snow again? Or maybe about oceans that don't boil?" James smiled. "I've got years of stories left. Pick whichever you want." Lyra rested a hand lightly on his shoulder. "And tomorrow," she said, "we begin the real work, training, doctrine, trust built one life at a time." James nodded. "Tomorrow." But tonight there was only the quiet garden, the slowly opening star vines, the child beside him, and the queen who had given him something rarer than citizenship, time to heal. He looked up at the unfamiliar constellations and felt no urgency to map them, no need to calculate escape vectors. Myra tugged his sleeve. He laughed softly. "All right. But this time I'll tell you how we built the fort first." As he spoke, the vines below began their nightly glow, soft, steady, eternal. Myra listened. Lyra listened. It was about home. And he had finally found one.
I'm the banner girl. La neta sí me sentí un poquito mal ahorita y ahorita ya me siento mejor, güey. Pero fácil sí vomitaba, ¿eh? Si no salía afuera sí vomitaba.
Yo tengo el corazón roto, eso cuenta como cicatriz. ¿Y el Tanjiro qué?
¿Qué verga es eso? ¿Tanjiro? No, pero no se ve ninguna cicatriz.
Allí estaba Tanjiro.
Pero no tiene ninguna cicatriz puesta, güey. También vi un Luffy y un zorro, güey. Ninguno tenía una de estas. Mira este, güey. A la verga, güey. Como mira, ahí hay un Sabusa, pero no tiene cicatriz, güey.
Here's the thing about mystery boxes. Mystery solved. This is
Oh, ¿cómo se llama ese güey de Naruto?
La del frente es una quemadura o algo así, tú dale, igual te la aceptan, güey.
No, ¿por qué tomas una foto chill, güey? Una foto chida.
Muchos paisas con sombrero parecen Wi-Fi.
Mira, ya encontramos un cabrón, güey.
Empuja al güey de blanco con cabeza negra y le puede salir una cicatriz.
Mejor no, otro. Es que hay que buscar uno chido, güey. O miren, también podemos enseñar esta. Tengo una foto de la guáchense. ¿Dónde está la foto? Pi. Nada, pero no tiene cicatrices. No te creas. Mira.
No hay Zoro.
Hay varios solos, pero no tienen disfraz, güey, vaya.
Hola, buenas tardes, ¿cómo les va?
Entonces sí. Bien, ¿y tú cómo andas, güey? Mucho pinche caminar, pero perfectamente bien.
Aquí nomás como que ya hace hambre.
Ya hace hambre, pero pues como que no va. No voy a comprar un pinche hot dog por $20, vete a la verga. Otro Gojo. Mira el Bowser. Ah, es un cosplay, mamón.